Kurds, of course, if you look at the map, and it's largely accurate, it's usually in yellow. I can't really see the map that you're showing, or maybe it's green now. I don't know which it is. But the point is that the western, southwestern, northeastern, southeastern and northeastern portions of Syria are largely under the control of Kurdish fighters, Kurdish independence fighters. They were anti-Islamist and did cooperate on a limited basis with Assad when it was in their interest to do so, because they didn't want to fall under Turkish hegemony. Well, now that's gone. Assad is gone. The forces that he commanded are gone. And what they have on their flanks are Islamists, Sunni Islamists, Arabs, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Kazakhs, and so forth, professional jihadists. And they have the Turkish military. And if there's one thing that President Erdogan would like to do, and I think most Turks would like to see, is the Kurdish threat to Turkey eliminated. And as long as you have what effectively amounts to an independent or autonomous Kurdish state, this is something that the Turks cannot possibly tolerate over the long run. Now, that means that the Iranians, and some of the Kurds are Shiites, the Iranians will undoubtedly offer support to the Kurds at this stage of the game. Whether or not that will help much is unclear. We'll be in a difficult position because we have told the Kurds that we're going to support them. And we have, but it may turn out to be in our interest to leave, in which case we're turning them over and the region over to the Turks. This is the kind of thing that we don't really understand. And right now, and I just want to throw this out so people are aware of it, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Azerbaijan and the Turks, the Azeri Turks in Azerbaijan, are virtually identical with the Turks that live in Anatolia, are looking at seizing the corridor that is controlled by Armenia right now that links Azerbaijan with Turkey. Mr. Erdogan refers to Azerbaijan and Turkey as two states in one nation. Azerbaijan is very close and has done a lot of work with the Israelis. The Israelis have supported them in their war against the Armenian Christians. And I suspect that in any real knockdown, drag-out war with Iran, that the Israelis will utilize the bases and locations inside Azerbaijan to ensure that there is a strong second front against Iran, or in Azerbaijan against Iran. So this is rapidly spreading and becoming finally a truly regional war, but it's still on the escalatory ladder. It's at the low end right now, but it could rise very, very quickly, almost overnight. And the Israelis are now eyeing Damascus. That too was identified as part of the Greater Israel Project.
Yeah, that's actually where I wanted to go next. In fact, the news this morning is that Israel has been on its massive bombing campaign, wiping out the Syrian Navy and wiping out a lot of their military bases, their armament capabilities, tanks, artillery pieces, ammunition storage warehouses. Literally, they're just taking out everything militarily. While, if you can throw that other map up there, while they're starting to move beyond the Golan Heights and as you say, in the direction of Damascus, it's unclear right now. And the Israelis have said nothing about what their territorial ambitions are. But how far do you think they could go in there? And is there a risk for them overextending and having too much of an appetite?
Well, if you look at Damascus, its location, it's actually quite close to the Israeli border. You can drive to Damascus on a good road in an hour, maybe a little more, but not much. So reaching Damascus quickly is not difficult. There's also not much between the Israeli border and Damascus. There are some villages, but they're very small, inconsequential. And from the Israeli standpoint, you could brush them off like you would fleas. The problem is that Damascus, like Jerusalem, is another great city in the Muslim world. These are places that are part of Islamic civilization, just as Baghdad was, so is Damascus, Cairo, and of course, Jerusalem. So I don't know what kind of effect that would have. That's a question you'll have to ask Mr. Netanyahu. I'm sure he would love to take Damascus and hold it, but would that suddenly interrupt his good relations with the Turks? I suspect it probably would. So it's hard to tell. But the point is that the Greater Israel Project that I would argue just a couple of weeks ago was DOA has now had real life breathed into it by the collapse of the Assad regime. And remember, we have puppets in Cairo and we have a puppet in Jordan. These puppets are paid off handsomely, and they are obedient to our will with regard to Israel. Now, Sisi is an amazing man. I'm surprised he's still alive because his population wants to go to war. I'm sure he has good security, and he's probably killed everybody that could possibly compete with him. But I wouldn't rule out that he could suddenly vanish from the screen if he continues on the same path, because right now he is purely a U.S.-Israeli puppet. Abdullah is in a different position. He's hostage to the Israelis for water for his country. The Israelis can cut off the water, and suddenly millions of people are going to die of thirst in Jordan, frankly. So I think Jordan is going to remain in this uneasy position, but the Islamists don't care about those things. And the Islamists will penetrate that Jordanian border as though there's nothing there. And once they move into that area, you could see chaos in Jordan as well. The point is that Israel has to be careful because what they think they can take and digest could, as you point out, be too much at this stage, and they could end up with more trouble on their flanks than they think. Remember that Hamas is not dead. It's been severely wounded, but it's not dead. And they have not succeeded in killing or driving out all of the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza. And they still want to do the same thing to the people living on the West Bank.
Right.
Because you only have so many forces, you can only stretch them so far. But the assumption has always been that people in the Middle East can be bribed, bullied, or bombed into submission. Well, I think the bribing and the bullying has reached almost its limits, and the bombing now has a serious effect, but I don't think the effect is going to be quite what it's been in the past. You're running out of really weak opponents and adversaries. You're going to start seeing some real resistance. And I'm talking primarily about the Iranians, their proxies in Iraq, as well as Kurdish elements and the Turks. These are serious people. They'll fight. It could get very, very bloody. Now, again, from an Israeli standpoint, they always look at their neighbors and celebrate whenever they kill each other. But the question is, what happens when that stops? Yeah. What happens when some new modus vivendi is reached? Do the Turks suddenly turn their gaze further to the west and look at Israel? There's nothing that would make Erdogan happier than to present himself as the savior of Islam and the liberator of the Islamic holy sites in Jerusalem.
Well, we'll certainly have to wait and see how that happens. I pray that it never comes to fruition. That just remains a distant aspiration. In the last few minutes we have here, though, I want to look at U.S. interests in particular. One of the things I've been arguing since really the first Trump administration all the way through has been our troops in Syria and Iraq especially are nothing but points of vulnerability, and we need to withdraw them all. But apparently that's not the view of the elite foreign policy, so-called, in the United States. And the outgoing administration seems to want to put a card on the ground here to say, hey, incoming administration, keep your hands off the troops there because they're desperately needed. Here's what Jake Sullivan said in trying to make the case to keep the troops there.
We have a presence both in Iraq and in Syria. That presence in Syria is there to work hand in hand with local partners to continue to suppress the threat that ISIS has posed going back many years now. And we've had significant progress in that fight just even in the last few months. Major players taken off the battlefield, large-scale degradation of those ISIS forces. But of course, an event like this happens, and ISIS immediately looks to take advantage. And we have seen reports of ISIS trying out in the Syrian Badia, the desert, to try to reconstitute to a certain extent. So we will continue to take action against that. And we will continue to make sure that force protection, the protection of our service members who are serving at a range of bases in eastern Syria, is the paramount concern from the president on down. The threat to those service members is not just from ISIS or from this violence. It is also from Iranian-backed Shia militia groups who themselves could try to take advantage of this. And so we are also doing what we believe we need to do to prepare for, deter, and protect against any potential attacks from that group of actors, which of course we have seen over the course of the past few years, and which we under the Biden administration have responded to at several points with direct strikes against those forces, both in Syria and in Iraq.
He makes the case that those troops there actually have combat power and that they can be used to defend American interests if they needed to be. But we're talking about roughly 2,500 in Iraq and 900 in all that vast expanse of Syria that you talked about a minute ago, and they're not doing anything there. So why do we want to keep those troops in there, and what do you think Trump will